Today's the final of our series on the work of Jean-Luc Marion, and we're going to be turning to a new book today, and that is this one, The Crossing of the Visible, which is on painting and aesthetics more generally, specifically chapter 2, which is entitled, What Gives? Now, the subject of this essay is the given, what gives itself to be seen specifically. We encounter the given, what gives itself to be seen, everywhere. We encounter it naturally, inevitably, all the time, everywhere. And so Marion begins by describing this ordinary situation vis-a-vis the visible. We don't need painters in order to see what gives itself to be seen. Ordinarily, there's a kind of dumb, stupid confidence in what's given to us. Specifically, that what's given to us is all that we need to see, all that we must see, that it is enough for us. So where does the encounter with painting enter into this ordinary situation? And we get Marion's answer on the bottom of page 24, the first page of the chapter, where he says, if, therefore, we have recourse, at least sometimes, to the indirect, deceptive, and optional spectacle of a painting, if we entrust our eye to the eye of a painter, as though one were following in the footsteps of a guide, this would thus only be in order to see something other than what is visible to us. In other words, the very point of viewing a painting is suggested here. It's only to access a visible or a visibility that would otherwise remain inaccessible to us, inaccessible to our vision, as it is within the ordinary situation in which everything is everywhere and always accessible, immediately, everywhere, always. In the case of the painting, we're accessing something that isn't immediately available everywhere and always simply by opening our eyes and going about our daily business. So the painter sees and gives to be seen what would otherwise remain unseen. It adds to the mass of what is seen what Marion calls an absolutely new phenomenon. And in this respect, it completes the world. So the world is incomplete without a painting. There's something in the world that is unseen. And so this, of course, contradicts our ordinary assumption, the natural attitude, this sort of stupid confidence, if you will, that everything that we see just by opening our eyes and having converse with our everyday life is enough for us. It gives us everything that we must see. The visible within the painting is a visible that basically shatters that stupid confidence that we ordinarily have in the sufficiency of our everyday understanding of what there is to be seen. So that's what sets up this essay in the first section. Moving on to section number 2, he lays out that what the painter makes visible is the unseen, or l'invu, which we've already discussed, and so this should come as no surprise to us at this point. But what we get in this chapter is a much more in-depth analysis than in some of the other chapters of certain aspects of this unseen. We got a pretty detailed analysis in the other chapters that we looked at, but in this one, we get a little bit more detail in some areas that are passed over rather lightly in the other chapters from the other works that we've looked at so far. Now, the unseen, l'invu, falls under the jurisdiction of the invisible, but it shouldn't be simply equated with the invisible as such or confused with it. Why is this? It sounds like the unseen and the invisible are the same thing. And this is one of the reasons, of course, that translators that we've looked at in all cases have seen fit to leave this French term as a kind of technical term rather than automatically translating it as the unseen or the unapparent. Partly because of the sort of resonances that it has with other related terms involving vu, but also because of the way in which he uses it in this technical way to distinguish it from the simply invisible. So there is this kind of technical sense of this. notion of the unseen or Lin Wu, because it is an unseen that paradoxically becomes visible. And that's the difficult, tricky thing to get your wrap your mind around when dealing with Marion's aesthetics is how this can be. How is it that the unseen is able to transgress the boundary between the visible and the invisible, and to appear within the visible, where apparently, according to an ordinary way of thinking, it should be impossible for it to appear? Doesn't the invisible remain forever invisible? Yes, the invisible per se remains forever invisible, but this special notion of Lin Wu, or the unseen, is a kind of emergence out of the invisible, of the unseen, into the realm of the visible. Okay, so we'll try to make this more clear in what goes forward here. Now, Marion compares the unseen's desire for visibility to the Aristotelian notion of matter's desire for form. So in Aristotle, you have this notion, which is a purely theoretical notion of prime matter. And prime matter for Aristotle is something that never actually appears in nature. It's just kind of a theoretical posit. Because what appears in nature for Aristotle is always going to be a substance. And a substance is made up of a certain kind of form. I mean, we can represent this by the boundary here, this kind of circular form, and a matter that occurs within the form, and that is given definition by the form. And the form is closely related in Aristotle with the essence, and this essence is what determines the nature of the material, how the material appears. And so sometimes Aristotle will speak of the upsurgence of form, or the desire of form the upsurgence or desire of matter for form. That material, this purely prime matter, doesn't have any being or reality without being instantiated in some very specific type of form. This is the way in which Marion wants to model the relationship between the invisible or the unseen and the seen or the visible as it appears in the painting. That there's within the invisible a kind of unseen Lin Wu that wants to come and emerge. It's kind of anthropomorphic way of describing it, but it's meant to be phenomenological. This unseen wants to come and burst through the boundary that separates out the visible from the invisible. So you have a picture of something like this, where this arrow represents the direction that Lin Wu wants to go, right? It belongs to the invisible, but it wants to crack through this divide between the invisible and the invisible. And this is what we find in the painting, is this breaking through of the invisible into the dimension of the visible. And the painter then is metaphorically described as a porter, or as a guardian of the limits of appearance. You know, a porter, like think of like a porter in an old-fashioned passenger train who's, you know, taking the tickets and so on, and helping people bring their bags onto the train and so forth, but also keeping people out who don't belong there, right? But the primary function of the porter is to facilitate, to bring people in into the vehicle, and that's what the painter is metaphorically compared to, a porter who's helping to bring people in. But he's also described as a guardian of the limits of appearance, which suggests a kind of gatekeeper role. But I think that what Marion has in mind more strictly is the idea that the painter is someone who is able to extend the limits of appearance. The painter is always the one who is on the side of bringing out the invisible, not so much on the side of keeping the invisible invisible. What would be the point of being a painter who is keeping the invisible invisible? Just the opposite. The painter wants to make the unseen seen. So the painter is also described in a kind of legalistic fashion as granting the right to presence or to appear. And it's worth mentioning this relationship because of its significance within the thought of both Heidegger and Derrida, which are, of course, major influences on Marion, as we've already remarked. that the invisible is going to be related with absence or non-presence. It's what's not, what I don't see is what's not within my phenomenal field. Whereas the visible is going to be associated with coming to presence, becoming present within my world. And the right to presence then is granted by the painter. So the painter has a special power. And we have to ask then, how does the painter acquire this power? Is this a power that the painter seizes through an act of will? Is this a power that the painter has because of a special sort of inherent power within his own soul or his own natural endowment, his natural talents? And what Marion does is much more cast the painter's power in a kind of passive or receptive role. Like a prophet in the Hebrew Bible, the power of divination, which he actually attributes to the painter, is a power that comes from reception. It's through the painter's receptivity to something that the painter acquires power. So it's not through an assertion of will. It's not through an assertion of technique or virtuosity or talent. It's through the painter's receptivity to what gives, thus the title. So this divination of the unseen is connected in a certain wandering. And of course, there's another very biblical religious connotation with this idea of the wanderer. We think of the wanderer in the desert, the place where the prophet traditionally encounters the divine on his wanderings. On 26, he says, this is 3 lines from the bottom of 26, and I'll be continuing to the top of 27. The painter like the blind man. You think also here of the Greek figure of Tiresias as a prophet seer who is blind, who because he lacks outward vision has the gift of inner vision. So I'm quite sure that Marion is self-consciously alluding to this as well. The painter, like the blind man, sees more than the visible, painting and seeing par excellence. The painter allows his gaze to wander in obscurity on this side of the visible. To wander in obscurity on this side of the visible. The painter is just looking, but not focusing on objects, but just looking at the obscurity of things. This calls to mind, to me, a class I took in painting years ago, where one of the things, those of us who were wearing glasses, the instructor said you should take them off and get used to just seeing the play of shadow and light in objects, and not concern yourself with the boundaries, but just concern yourself with the experience of shadow and light, the obscurity, without the sharp lines between things. And some of you who've taken classes in painting might have had a similar sort of experience, so you know what I'm talking about. But the painter allows his gaze to wander in obscurity on this side of the visible, slipping under the line of visibility. Here we have to kind of turn our picture here on the side, right? Slipping under the line of visibility. If you think of the invisible as a kind of invisible ground out of which there's an upsurge. And this, in fact, is one of the alternative pictures that Marion will use for the relation between the invisible and the visible, especially when he connects it with Aristotle's notion of phusis, or transliterated in various ways, but like, let's do it this way. Phusis, from which we get the word physics, which is the Greek word for nature, which in Aristotle refers to this sort of upsurge of the materiality of being and coming into form, which is characteristic of nature, this Aristotelian understanding. So we get this wandering in obscurity on this side of the visible, slipping under the line of visibility, positioned just under the watermark of the visible. There's a lot of literary demonstration going on here, all these images. but the image of the watermark of the visible, right? The visible becomes like the watermark, like on your dollar bills, that you hold up to light to make sure that your 20 is actually a 20 as opposed to a counterfeit 20 that was really made out of a $5 bill that they effaced and remade as a 20. So you see that watermark on there, but you see through it, and that's what the phenomenon is like as it presents itself to the painter when he's looking in this particular way. The visible presents itself as a watermark through which the invisible can shine, can be seen. As in subwork, in the darkened hold of the visible that still saturates the unseen. There's still a darkened hold, and this is what later on he'll describe as the background or the fund or the reserve of the invisible that is contained pregnantly within the visible as it presents itself to us. What doesn't emerge into visibility, but it's there in some sense. And here we begin to see the connection with other philosophers that we've looked at in this course. First and most obviously with Heidegger and Heidegger's notion of earth, out of which world emerges, right? You see a clear lineage here between Heidegger's phenomenology and Marion's. So the painter goes back to the creation of the world, he says, half witness, half archangel laborer. So it is a very romantic image of the painter. The painter runs a moral risk in this, going back to the origin, back before the creation of order, back to the original chaos of this sort of, pure visibility and invisibility that are interpermeating each other in this as yet unformed fashion. The frontier of the visible or the invisible is described as an undecidable frontier. This notion of an undecidable, this is a notion that Marion inherits from his teacher Jacques Derrida. And some of you with familiarity with deconstruction will be familiar with the notion of an undecidable. So just very briefly, according to Derrida, Western culture has long been built on a binary conceptual order. So to allude, first of all, to one of Derrida's sources for this, you have Nietzsche, who wrote the famous work Beyond Good and Evil, Beyond Good and Evil. And Nietzsche also pointed out in the Genealogy of Morals and elsewhere that there's this sort of binary mode of thinking that's been determinative of Western civilization. So we divide things into good and evil, into black and white, into high and low, into alive and dead, into present and past, or present and absent, into male and female, etc., 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 right? And everything, true or false, is another big one. And everything has to be in one category or the other. And that's the way our minds are conditioned to work by our civilization. And so Derrida aims to show that all of this is a construction. All of this is a construction. All of these binary oppositions between true and false, good and evil, etc., are constructed oppositions. And so therefore they can be deconstructed. And the point at which they become deconstructed is when they encounter anomalies that they cannot account for, that cannot be slotted into one or the other. Something that is neither good nor evil, neither true or false, neither past nor present, neither man nor woman. For example, something like a hermaphrodite, who is neither man nor woman. Or something like a zombie, that's neither alive nor dead. And that's what he termed the undecidables. And the undecidables are those sites or those nodes at which the construct is unraveled. That it shows that this is not an absolute hermetically sealed system, but there are these gaps, these breaks in it. And so this concept of the undecidable is what Marion is applying to the frontier between the visible and the invisible, suggesting that in this phenomenon of Lin Wu, as it emerges into the painting, there actually is a kind of undecidable. And he'll connect this with another notion that he describes as the archetype, But we'll come back to that in a few minutes. So the frame in which the painting rests is likened by Marion to the gate of the underworld. And here he's thinking particularly of Hades and the myth of Orpheus, who went to recover his Eurydice from Hades through his songs. And Orpheus was also equated in the early Christian era with Christ. You might recall that Christ was said to have descended to the dead and then rose on the third day. So there's Good Friday when Christ died, Holy Saturday when Christ descended to the dead, and then on Easter Sunday he rose again. And when the question arose in theologians' mind about what exactly Christ was doing down there with the dead, there are different theories, but the kind of predominant view was that Christ had actually gone down to the dead in order to rescue the righteous dead from Hades. So it's an image that evokes the idea of Orpheus's journey to rescue his beloved Eurydice from Hades. And Marion then is saying that, in a sense, every painting participates in a resurrection by bringing the unseen to light. So that is, we have to turn our graph on the side in this way here and see invisibility as, the depths, right? This is Hades down here, and the painter is like Orpheus or like Christ and is rescuing the invisible from the depth, bringing the unseen to light. Now, the unseen, of course, only appears to disappear as such, because once the unseen appears, it's no longer unseen. And so this gets us into this whole realm of the undecidable, exactly what the status is of the unseen, and so insofar as it appears in the painting. If it's appearing, it's seen, it seems, it needs to be seen, but it has this character of belonging to the unseen, so how is he going to account for that? And especially the second part, how is he going to make sense of this idea that the Lin Vu is actually unseen, even though there it is, it's seen, in the painting. So we'll come back to that, though. But first, he wants to make this distinction between the unseen and the pre-seen. Painting never renders a real pre-seen. And this is also related to what he describes as the anticipated. So his view of painting is that the painter is never someone who has a clear idea in mind about what he wants to paint or what he wants to make visible until it's made visible. The painter isn't someone who has a complete blueprint. The painter is the person who uses the brush as if it were an excavating tool and is pulling out the unseen from the realm of the invisible and into the realm of the seen with his brush, and is not someone who is just manufacturing these paintings, such as the one behind here, which was manufactured in a factory. It's a painting, but it was painted in a way that was where many of the same kind of paintings were made at once. This is not a painting for Marion. This is a piece of technology. The painter is the one who never really is able to say in advance what it is that he's going to be creating. And if he can, then what happens is academicism, academic painting, right? So like in the traditional academy where everyone goes through and paints, for example, the same piece of sculpture in a certain style, just in order to be able to practice achieving verisimilitude of appearance in the painting and study of anatomy and this sort of thing. So there's not a painting really going on there. There's a kind of academic exercise. Now, interestingly, with regard to ready-made art, like Duchamp's fountain, the urinal, for example, the famous urinal that Marcel Duchamp exhibited as a work of art, he says that this actually does have the status of painting or art because it does complete justice to the unseen. what that kind of art is doing, ready-made art, someone finds a piece of junk in the junkyard and exhibits it. Someone finds a urinal and puts it in a museum. What's happening there is that the unseen within the ordinary or visible is being highlighted and is being showcased in that kind of situation, at least according to Marion. So he says on 28, this is about 7 lines from the bottom on 28, he says, ready-made art does complete justice to the unforeseen appearance of the work, since it takes up the object that was seen before as completely defined by its banal usage and mass production, and resituates it, so to speak, in the unexpected, sort of like the unperceivable, or the unseen. Between the store and the museum, the bottle holder has taken a bath in the unseen, and its absolutely new invisibility has no other legitimacy than the fact that it has just made it through. So the bottle, ordinary bottle holder or some ordinary object takes a bath in the unseen, he says, right? It becomes washed. It's a baptismal image, right? You're washed from your sin. In this case, the ordinary object is washed from its banality, its merely manufactured, mass-produced character, and it makes it through barely, he says, as a work of art. It's been immunized from such banality by being bathed in the unseen, and then it emerges visible among the visibles. So you can think about what you think about that particular interpretation of ready-made art. And of course, as always, I encourage you to use the advantage of the internet that is available to you right now to look up some other examples of ready-mades. Okay. The painting has the character for Marion of a kind of human being. It lives as human beings do. It's for itself. It's unique. It's irreplaceable. And he goes on to describe the way in which there's even a kind of monstrous character to the painting, a kind of brute otherness. And I think this is meant to evoke, in some respects, the frightening character of being confronted by another human being, the sense that you're being confronted by another freedom that isn't completely in your control, and that this person has a kind of unpredictability to them. And that is a kind of bruteness that is involved in the painting. Especially in the work of Caravaggio, Vouet, and El Greco. The painting is saturated with a new brute unseen, a monstrousness. Okay. Now the unseen for Marion has a kind of autonomy. I've already alluded to the idea that the painter is very much a receptive figure, not an agent, not an active figure. It's the painting in a certain sense for Marion paints itself. And of course that sounds absurd, and Marion recognizes it sounds absurd, but he tries to clarify how that's compatible with what we see in the activity of the painter if we were just observing the painter. If we were an ethnographer of the art studio or just watching painters and their behavior, how do we square that with this idea that the painting is painting itself? So the unseen imposes itself in the visible in complete independence from Marion, he says on page 29. And it calls to us. So here, switching to the figure of the recipient, the regarder, the person who views it, the audience. We see a painting because its intrinsic visibility imperatively calls to us. It calls out to us. He says it calls out like the prisoner, the sick, the orphan, thinking about that's kind of the ethical call of the person in need. The painting calls to us like view me, view me. There's a sort of call that's contained in the painting that we respond to almost with a kind of ethical response, right? So this further supports the idea of the painting of having this kind of quasi-human status. The painting breathes, and this is again, we're anthropomorphizing here, it sounds like, right? But it's a phenomenological description, and he'll fill this in with more details in a minute. The way in which the painting breathes. It breathes in visibility, and it inhales the unseen from the depths, and it exhales it in liberation. Like a meditation. In through your nose, out through your mouth, right? Inhaling in from the invisible, exhaling out into the visible. It's the breathing of the painting. The painting still appears dripping in the formless and colorless obscurity from which it came, as in a kind of amniotic fluid. It appears, it's got this kind of goo on it, like a baby just out of the womb. He says on page 31. So there's two contradictory attractions that the painting has upon the spectators. I already mentioned the way in which it calls to us, attracts us to be seen. So the first of the two contradictory attractions would be the fascination of the gaze by the irresistible attraction of its weight of glory. The fascination of the gaze by the irresistible attraction of its weight of glory. So this idea of glory is an important aspect of the visibility. Glory, which is a traditional attribute of God, of God's radiant appearing in a sort of epiphany. And then or theophany, I guess that was the word I'm looking for, appearance of God. So the fascination of the gaze by the weight of its glory is the first. And the second is the terror in the face of the power it exerts in the name of the darkness from which it arises. The terror in the face of the power it exerts in the name of the darkness from which it arises. So there's glory in its visibility, but it's trailing also this monstrousness that I described earlier. The terror, this reminds me of Rilke's first Duino elegy, where he talks about the beauty as the beginning of terror. So there's a kind of glory that's also associated with a terror involved here. And that's the character of the encounter with the painting, the authentic painting. Not everything that counts as a painting, not that. But with the authentic painting, that's the character. So it follows that the authentic painting registers itself in the visible only if it's ordered to be there, as by commander. But the true painter is not this commander. The true painter doesn't claim ownership over his painting as if it were his slave or his mistress. Marion says, he's French, so it's quite natural to assume that a painter is going to have a mistress if you're French. The true painter recognizes the independence of the painting from his own personality. Marion even goes so far as to say on 31 that the true painter doesn't know what he painted. It's not up to him. This is part of this trend towards the death of the author idea in French philosophy. That the author, isn't really the authority. The author isn't the one that has the authoritative interpretation of his work, certainly. The author doesn't know exactly what was created. The painter doesn't know exactly what he painted. The unseen, rather, bursts into the visible by surprise. And that seems to be quite natural if it's connected with this sort of terror, right? The terror might very well be a terror of surprise, a terror of the emergence of the unforeseen and the fear of the unknown and the unforeseeable. And the moment at which it appears, he says, coincides with complete emancipation from its guardian. The painter is not trying to, put into the scene something he foresees as a pre-delineated object, something that he desires or wills. but rather the authentic painting, if it does begin from a plan in some vague sense, the painter says, I want to paint, Cezanne's out there in, the provinces or whatever, trying to paint this meadow or what have you, or this mountain. So he's got a general plan of what he's trying to do. But the authentic painting fulfills the expectation and surprises it, disorients it, and floods it. And the same is true of the spectator who approaches a painting. We all have some general idea of, what the Mona Lisa looks like or something like that. And we might very well have the opportunity to see in person paintings that we've looked up for the purposes of this class on internet, sites and digital reproductions. And so we already have a sense of what to see. But Marion's claim is that the authentic painting is going to fulfill your expectation, but not by presenting to you something that was exactly like you expected. So you just say, just as I expected. No, rather the authentic painting fulfills your expectation by surprising it, which sounds kind of paradoxical, but disoriented and then flooding it with more than you expected. It fulfills an expectation of the unexpected. So an authentic painting then annuls our original desire that brought us to it in order to give rise to a new one. And I think that holds for both the painter and the spectator. It's the painting that has to train us to see it. And here's where he says we can define the distance between the idol and the icon. And this will be the final word about this relationship. Where here, at least in this work, it's pretty clear that Marion sees the relationship of idol and icon as a kind of continuum, where the idol is the first stage of a painting, which is succeeded by the icon, which is a greater stage. But there is a continuum between the two. But the idol is a less great achievement than the icon along the same continuum. So let's see here. This is on page 33. It's still in section 4, about a dozen lines down. He says here, the painting must train us to see it. The distance between the idol and the icon is defined here. The idol still remains, in one way or another, proportionate to the expectation of desire. Thus it fulfills, sometimes to a degree more than expected, the anticipation. So with the idol, we expect to see something and it completely fulfills it, sometimes to a degree more. But the icon definitively exceeds the scope of expectation, terrifying the desire, annulling the anticipation. It is neither willing nor able to undertake to correct this gap, the gap between the expectation and fulfillment. The icon inverts it while substituting its own aim, its aim towards us. Remember, that's this idea that the icon reverses the original relationship where I go to this painting in order to be able to see something that I've been desiring to see. And instead what I encounter is the icon is looking at me. It is desiring something from me rather than me desiring something from it. The icon inverts this aim while substituting its own aim, its aim towards us, in place of ours towards it. But one should not be deceived. For the painting to reach the rank of an idol is already a remarkable achievement. For the idol, a first visible, not overtaken by gaze, arrests and fills the gaze. It freezes in an invisible mirror. The gaze is proportioned to the idol from which it learns, in the same way that an echo that is sent back to a radar works to situate one in space, to the extent that it is allowed to fill it. The authentic painting would not give itself to be seen in such glory if it had not taken and surprised our scope of expectation. We depend more upon it in gazing upon it than does it upon us. So the idol is a real achievement, but it has this mirroring function that we've discussed earlier, whereas the icon goes beyond that. And it has the glory and terror of really disconcerting us because it's desiring us. It wants something from us, and it's demanding something of us, and it's reflecting its own intentions towards us in a way that is surprising and that we didn't expect. Okay. Now, clearly, what Marion's been describing here is a kind of normative theory of painting. You know, this idea of the authentic painting. And that, of course, in its very nature implies that paintings can be divided into the authentic and the inauthentic. And so we can always ask the question about something that exhibits itself and gives itself out as painting, such as that, is this painting? And for Marion, a lot of it turns out to not be painting. In section 5, he asks, what sort of painting remains possible today? And here we get his lesson about the evolution of contemporary painting, that this autonomous glory of painting has disappeared. The authority of the work that suddenly appears and bursts forth from the unseen into the visible. That isn't the typical experience of painting. And there's two ways in which contemporary painting sort of fails in this respect. The first is when it limits itself to being a mere recording of the most fitting private impressions or spectacles for the desiring gaze. When the painting isn't assured of an autocratic authority derived from its own glory. The gaze forces it to appear as it appears. It represents the desire to be seen or to make itself seen. That is to say, the gaze's desire to see or to make itself seen. It's a recording of the depths of desire for a spectacle that no longer provides any pleasure, but rather disgust. And he connects this with examples from Monet to Pollock, Matisse, Masson, and action painting. So this first painting limits itself to a mere recording of the desire of the gaze, all right? So that's the first kind. Painting falls short by limiting itself to a mere recording of the desire for the gaze, or of the gaze, rather. The second is when it disappears, it becomes a depleted thing and it's abandoned in favor of conception. It's abandoned in favor of conception. So, of course, within this category, you're going to find all the forms of conceptual art, all those forms of art that have a kind of political agenda or political message, right? The important thing isn't the visibility or the unseen coming into visibility, but rather it's whatever the conceptual content of the painting is that's conveyed. And this is basically, for Marion, what defines most of the limits of contemporary painting. And so for this reason, the autonomous glory of painting has disappeared. This bursting forth of the unseen into the visible happens less and less. And this naturally gives rise to a question, why is this? Why is this the situation of contemporary painting? And a lot of this is attributable, he thinks, to technology. What he describes as the technical project. And technology is connected to him with a couple other related concepts. The regime of technique, which is a regime of form, which is a regime of objectivity. So these three terms, technique, form, and objectivity, provide a kind of summary of the explanation for why painting fails in these respects. That painting has become an imitator of the examples of the exact sciences and technology, and because it has become enamored with the new technical possibilities, in part new technical possibilities that are raised by the availability of technologies and instruments, new forms of making painting and of painting, and of assembling paintings and new materials and so forth. But also there's this sort of general modern spirit of technical mastery and dominance that has taken over even the arts. And so, the premium is placed on achieving something technically that has not been achieved before. And Marion says that this is Picasso that's responsible for a lot of this model of how one should paint. Attempting to achieve something in painting that hasn't been achieved before through a certain kind of technique that has not been employed before. So the employment of technique is the employment of the painter's power. It is a deployment of the painter's agency. And therefore, it's a kind of activity of the painter. And it's the opposite of the way that Marion was describing the painter before, as a diviner, as a receiver. And so there's a sharp contrast that can be drawn between the kind of painting that leads to this failure of painting through technique, form, and the creation of objectivity, and the kind of painting that involves the emergence of the invisible or the unseen into the visible. The basic difference is the origin. Does the painting begin from itself, or does it begin from the painter? And here we return to this question and this appearance of absurdity of the idea that the painting actually should begin from itself. Surely we want to say every painting begins from a work. That is to say, a working, an activity, a worker that is working, and therefore belongs to the painter. But he says this obvious fact does not hold. The truly creative painter is characterized not by some kind of inventiveness in imposing his will on some plastic medium, but rather by a passive receptivity. So we have the idea of the painter as a kind of eliminator. And some of you will be familiar with this idea in connection with the sculptor. I think we've mentioned this before in class. This idea of the sculptor as the one who merely frees the sculpture from the piece of stone, who has to know sort of where the lines are in the marble or whatever, and to how to cut it and chisel it so that the sculpture is freed from the stone. And so the sculptor in this respect is an eliminator rather than an adder or an assembler. Right? This is the Orpheus image again, the liberator. The sculptor liberates the sculpture from the rock. And Marion wants to use that same image to describe the painter. The painter is an eliminator. Among a million possible lines, he knows how to choose the one that imposes itself on the canvas by its own necessity. He likens the painter's brush to a blind man's cane. The painter is brushing on the painting and is just trying to find his way around the painting with the brush and choosing those lines that are necessary within the context of the other lines and rubbing out and eliminating other ones. So the painter's brush is a sort of blind man's cane that's being used to navigate the landscape. And there's a kind of, Marion will connect this with this image of the space of the painting, the space of the canvas, which is not identical to the space of the painting, but there's a distance that is going to be an important concept for his understanding of how the phenomenology of painting should be described. So there's an element of aesthetic necessity to what the painting does. The painter does. It's not an arbitrary exercise of will and choice. There's a kind of involuntary going along with what the painting wants element. There's a necessitation that the painting is demanding. He also describes the painter as a seismologist seismographer, I think it's translated here, as of the unseen. The painter's brush records the cracks of the unseen. These cracks of the unseen is what he calls the ectypes, which are the stigmata of the unseen. the ectypes or the stigmata. So the stigmata are, of course, the wounds of Christ that various saints have been blessed with throughout history, which emerge sort of spontaneously, out of the palms or the feet or the side. And some have full stigmata, and some stigmatics only have them in the hands or in the feet. And so he's using this image of the painter sort of drawing out the unseen as these sort of cracks within the crust of the earth. Again, this Heideggerian sense of earth. These cracks in the crust of the earth through which these ectypes, which are stigmata of the unseen, emerge. And that's what the painter is doing with the brush. It's like the sculptor's hammer and chiseling away to free up the work of art underneath. So the ectype, he talks about the ectype, which refers to a species that's distinct to a certain habitat, as opposed to a type. And the type he's thinking here of type as, for example, type in a book, an impression that's imposed by the outside. A type, a mark, an impression imposed. The ectype is a type that emerges from within its own habitat. So that's the contrast there. He refers to this as the ectype because he's thinking of the contrast between a certain kind of idea of the artist as the imposer of his will onto the passive but maybe recalcitrant medium, as a kind of imposition of a type or a form onto that object. That's not the way it works. It's a kind of a stigmatic emergence from a particular habitat. And so these fissures or cracks in the unseen are things that the painter is drawing out in this kind of what's the word I want to use? A sort of midwifing role, right? Maieutic, is that the term? I think it might be. But anyway, that's the basic picture. Now, connected with this is, he says, the idea of the trace. On page 38, he says, the painting traces itself from itself. It traces itself from itself, suddenly appearing in these ectypes. And here we have another term from Derrida, the idea of the trace. So the trace in Derrida is one form of undecidable. It's an undecidable that's neither present nor absent at the origin of meaning. An undecidable is neither present nor absent at the origin of meaning. What do we mean by this? Well, some of you will be familiar with this from your studies in continental philosophy more generally. So this is a basic idea of deconstruction that Derrida gets from de Saussure, the Swiss linguist, that the signifying function of various words or signs pertains to the differences between them. So cat refers to cat, has the meaning of cat because it's not bat and it's not can. Okay? So what does this have to do with the trace? Well, in Derrida's analysis, there's a trace of the absent be in the word cat. Because in order for me to give sense to this group of markings, I have to not only be aware of the cat, but I also have to be the C here, but I also have to be aware of the fact that it's not a B, because the sense only comes from the difference between this and, of course, other letters. Similarly, I have to be aware that this T is not an N, right? So present, as it were, in an absent way in the T is the not N. That's it here. So hopefully that makes some sense, but that gives you a sense of how there's a kind of undecidability here. Is the N present or absent? Well, it's both. It's neither present nor absent totally, right? It's not literally present in the word cat. There's no N in the word cat, but there is, in a way, a kind of absent present N if you buy this Caesarean theory of meaning, because we have to be somehow representing the absent N when we represent the T in cats, so that we can distinguish the word cat from the word can, or the senses of the two words. So what does this trace have to do with Marion's aesthetics? Marion seems to want to say that the unseen is present in an absence in a comparable way. The unseen is present in an absence in a way comparable to the way in which the N and the B are present in an absent way in the word cat on this account. The unseen as such and by definition cannot be seen, but the painting cannot remain totally untouched from that from which it escaped. And I think that if you think about that as comparable to or parallel to this idea of the way in which the word cat contains a kind of absent presence of the letters T and the letters B and other letters as a trace, you get a bit of the sense of what he's describing here. The unseen cannot be seen, but the painting cannot remain totally untouched. But now he's going to try to describe it in more phenomenological terms, the way in which there's this trace undecidable of something in the ectype that is not exactly unseen and not exactly seen. Between the visible and the unseen lies the fond, in French, which in different contexts is translated as the background or the bottom. Usually as the background. And this background is not the background in the usual sense. It's not the background that you see in the painting, right? It's not like this sky or whatever is the background. What's surrounding or filling up the spaces in between the figures. Nor is it one of the ectypes. The fund and the ectype are two aspects. Rather, it's the ectypes originate from it, as from their most intimate unseen. So you can see here there's a kind of rough, we want to be careful, we want to just equate things from different philosophers, but you can see that there's a kind of parallelism here between the idea of world in Heidegger and the idea of earth, between the ectype and the fond, or the background in Marion. Now this fond also, of course, you can see the relationship etymologically through a couple of transformations that Marion makes with the idea of a fund or a reserve. And that also naturally calls to mind this Heideggerian notion of earth, this sort of indeterminate reserve of meanings, right? But for Marion, he introduces this as a reserve of the unseen, and connects it again with this Greek and Aristotelian notion of physis or physis, the nature that erupts, that climbs upwards and into form. On this fund, he writes on page 40, this is about 8 lines down, it is a matter of representing the dark opening from which the unseen nevertheless expels the unforeseen, to the great horror of the gaze, in a crushing defeat of the unseen as much as the foreseen. The eruption of the ectypes to the surface surprises, overwhelms, and subverts the painting, which, like us, expected everything except this. So it's this volcanic image of we talked about the fissures earlier, out of the background, out of the reserve, this volcanic pool beneath the earth emerges these ectypes in the fissures within the unseen. Now, one thing he makes clear is that the painting doesn't give forms. Again, you remember before I said he wanted to, I erased it now, but he wants to associate form with objectivity and technique. Form concerns objectivity. And when a painting becomes this, he says it undergoes a shipwreck. The authentic painting escapes reduction to any specific region of the visible by instantly vibrating with the battle between the archetypes and the fund within it. So this, again, you hear the echo of the battle between earth and world, or the strife between earth and world in Heidegger. But here it's between the archetypes and the fund. There's a vibration between these, he says. And so it doesn't arrive at a determinate, settled form. The painting lives off, rather, the distance. And that's another important, actually, technical term here, the distance between the fund and the archetypes. This is sort of like the rift, I think. Some of you might take exception to this, but I think that's roughly what it corresponds to, the distance between the archetypes and the funds as they confront one another. And the gaze of the spectator has to cross this distance. He says we cross this distance as spectators like crossing a dance floor. This is about 10 lines up from the bottom of page 41. The painting lives off the distance itself, where the archetypes and the fund confront one another with neither hatred nor reconciliation. It lives off their distance because it breathes in it. Remember the breathing, right, between the drawing in out of the unseen and drawing out into the visible. It lives off their distance because it breathes in it. The distance allows you to breathe. You need distance between you and other objects in order to breathe. And that's what he's playing off of here. It lives off their distance. The painting lives off their distance because it breathes in it. It breathes the distance. And then in parentheses, it breathes the distance. It breathes in the distance, which is the same thing. Because this airing out, rustling in it, there hollows out a cavern where it circulates. In the space of objectivity, thus dug and renewed, the painting inhales and exhales. A grace raises it and in turn deposes it. Far from remaining inert under the watch of the gaze, the painting imposes its internal rhythm upon the spectator. The painter imposes this internal rhythm, this breathing, on the spectator, who must follow it and adapt to it, as a dancer follows the rhythm of a musical piece. The distance which airs out of the painting silently calls to it to come and devote itself to the oscillations between archetypes and the fund. The gaze must thus cross the distance from which the painting draws its own life. You have to cross, as it were, the dance floor of the distance between the archetypes and the fund. It is the painting that brings the gaze to life, not the other way around. It is the painting that grants to the gaze the ability to make this crossing, as well as the climb from the unseen towards the visible, the liberation of the archetypes, and the exhausted collapse of the fund. Strictly speaking, it's not so much that we learn to see the painting as that the painting, by having given itself, teaches us to see it. Okay, so that's what it is to authentically encounter a painting as a spectator. What the painting gives to us is what ordinarily does not rise to the level of objectivity. It gives to us this blooming, buzzing confusion of the invisible that is permeating what is seen at all times, but it gives it to us in a way that we can metaphorically dance in it, that we can have some kind of order, but the order is a dynamic one. It's not the order of fixing it as an object, as something fixed and determinate and solid, but rather it's moving along with the motion and the breathing of the painting itself. And in that motion, we are presented with what among the visible that we are immersed in as our environment doesn't normally rise to the level of objectivity. And in fact, it doesn't rise to the level of objectivity in the painting either. Rather, we're presented what's beyond objectivity, what's more primordial and more fundamental than objectivity. Namely, what's unavailable to us, what can't be mastered by technique, or can't be mastered by form. And in this way, the painting liberates our gaze from objectivity. It teaches us that there's more to being than the objective, because the objective refers to what we can, at least theoretically, master and control. And the gaze is no longer limited to that aspect of being in its encounter with the painting. So in the nihilistic context of the contemporary world, the painting provides a rare challenge to this sort of mastery, this claim of mastery. Seeing a painting is a kind of Gelassenheit, if you're familiar with this term, which is a term originally from the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart that then was adapted and became an important term in Heidegger, especially later Heidegger. It means something like letting be. Letting be. You know, like the Beatles song, Let It Be. Right? But it's letting being be. That's what we do in Gelassenheit. And in Eckhart, this was the way in which to sort of come into contact with God. And in Heidegger, it's the way to come into contact with being. In Marion, I would say that seeing a painting is a kind of Gelassenheit. Vision of painting and vision in general. I mean, we become aware in seeing the painting that vision itself is the reception of a gift. In painting, it's reception of a gift to eyes that did not expect it. Now, Marion says that painting itself is not a revelation. I mean, viewing an authentic painting in this authentic way is not akin to coming into contact with God. So it's not, Meister Eckhart's version of Gelassenheit, certainly. But it is a purification. It's a purification of the gaze in such a way that prepares it to potentially reveal a future revelation of glory. That's what it does. All right, so this is a little bit of a long video, but there's a lot here to say. So I hope that you enjoyed this and got something out of it. I look forward to your comments. We'll continue on with Chrétien next time.